You might not know this, but hypnosis actually played a pretty large role in the thinking of Henri Bergson in his understanding of consciousness and psychology. Hypnosis was growing in popularity at the time when he was young, and in the 1880s, he conducted research on hypnosis and actually published an article on his studies. And hypnosis is a major phenomena that he looks at within time and free will as playing an essential role in aesthetic emotions, and aesthetic sentiments, aesthetic feelings play a central role in the arguments of that book. So I'll start just by reviewing the article that he wrote on hypnosis, and then I will dig deeper into the ideas surrounding it and make a number of connections to other ideas in his philosophy, and then end by generally talking about hypnosis and its relation to philosophy and psychology today. The article, which was published in 1886, was titled Unconscious Simulation in the State of Hypnosis. As far as I know, it hasn't been translated into English, but I'll summarize the basic ideas of it here. There was this hypnotist going around the city that Bergson was living in at the time, Clermont-Ferrand, and he was hypnotizing people and having them, well, he would give them the command to read his mind and read what he saw on a piece of paper in front of him. But they could not see the piece of paper directly. So the patients in the hypnotic state were guessing what was on the page with better than random accuracy, or better than just guessing. And people were saying that this was remote viewing or some kind of psychical porosity, mind reading that was going on in the hypnotic state. And basically Bergson shows that there's nothing like that going on, but what is going on is that the patient is actually seeing a reflection of what is written on the page in the eye of the doctor, right? They can actually see a tiny image reflected in the eye, in the cornea. And so there is actually something quite amazing here, which is that they are capable of perceiving and sensing this very minute detail. And so the hypnotized state, he wants to say, is one of an extremely heightened sense capacity and alertness, but broad, without any direct focus. And in the process of trying to show that the patient was indeed reading very small reflections off the eyes, Bergson also discovered that because the doctor commands the patient to read their mind, the patient believes they have the capacity to read the doctor's mind and doesn't actually know that they are reading the letters off the cornea. So there's a kind of relative independence of the sensory system in its heightened state and the conscious mind as it comes when we reconstruct this experience in our memory afterwards. It's as if the patient has no idea that they read it and convinces themselves through this command from the doctor that they in fact read the doctor's mind. They can't understand how they've done it. And this is somewhat typical of certain hypnotic states. So sometimes hypnotists will implant this command: I have this coin, and if I take this coin out of my pocket, you should take it out of your hand and stick it in your pocket. And then they wake up the patient from the hypnotized state and they initiate this scenario, and the person grabs the coin as they were commanded and sticks it in their pocket. And then when they are questioned, they make up reasons. Oh, that's my coin, or that's my friend's coin. I was going to give it back to them, or something like that. Bergson then gets the idea to do a little bit further experimenting and attempt to understand better this ability of a person to tap in with their senses in a heightened way. So they put a patient under and they give them this command, this suggestion that they feel everything that happens to this other person who's there in the room. Anything that they feel in their body, you feel in your body. This is the command given. And then they proceed to prick this person with a needle, and the patient feels this pain and will oftentimes even cry out in pain. And Bergson pushes this a bit further. He says, well, we don't know that this person is actually feeling what the other person is feeling. And in order to show this, sometimes they don't actually prick the person with the pin. They just make it look like they're pricking them, and the patient still feels the prick even when they are faking it. So what this shows us is that there's an intense connection, we could say, like mirror neuronal level. There is an entrainment, that there is a parasympathetic sense, that the person is heightenedly aware in this suggestion of the other person's affects and the other person's body and well-being. And Bergson is calling this unconscious simulation. There is an unconscious simulation going on, and in the state of hypnosis, we can isolate it and see it going on because the conscious mind is, in a sense, deactivated. And this is the really important aspect of hypnotized state for Bergson, is that it shuts off the analytic mind, but it does so without necessarily disabling our reason. When we are in this tranquil state, we have no motive, we have no plotting, we are not oriented towards any actions, but we are capable of doing logistics if we have something implanted in us, if we have a suggestion given to us. We also sort of interrupt our emotional states. We are not connected to the emotions that we were feeling before we entered this state. We are not connected to our life and the world from before this state. We are in a kind of detached zone of disconnection from the world and from our past. But it is possible in the hypnotized state to begin having emotions, to take on certain suggestions, and to gradually move back in the direction of action and engagement. It only ever partially subdues our consciousness. It is a quasi-conscious state. It is indeed less emotional and less spotlight engaged, but indeed our moral sense is also not impaired. This is clear. People will follow certain suggestions, but you can't hypnotize somebody into murdering someone. It is a calm and open, but not necessarily alert on any specific, giving attention specifically to anything. And likewise, it is open to images and memories, but it is not attempting actively to recall anything specific, nor is the conscious mind prescribing to the imagination what it should create. The hypnotist is therefore able to guide someone's imagination, right? But this also means that the hypnotist can suggest the person create images in a certain way, and their own mind, the patient's own mind, is going to do the work and can go in its own direction. So the hypnotist does not have absolute control over the imagination and mind and executive faculties in some kind of absolute sense. And so this state of the hypnotized allows for memories to come back in a different way, and allows for more openness to our memories. And it is possible that forgotten memories can be retrieved, but it is equally as possible that you can have memories that are actually just fantasies and imaginations, and they appear to us so vividly as a kind of lucid dream, but a lucid dream that we interpret as a memory. And so it's possible for people to have falsely implanted memories. And this is a big question for contemporary use of hypnosis within psychotherapy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So one really important idea to focus on for a bit is that, the hypnotic state is a unordinary state. It is an altered state, but it is also an ordinary state, and there's something hypnotic in many of our psychological states. One we should consider first is play. In play, we kind of forget about the world. We forget about our worries. We just engage playfully in what we're doing at that moment. And it is a kind of alert state, or at least it can be, right? When we play a sport or something like that, we are very focused. We're in a kind of flow state with no distractions. And we joyfully engage, and we can endure efforts and trials in this state. And we can sort of ignore the pain or the discomfort, but we can also tune into our body, and we can also tune into other people's bodies more attentively, more in tune without having to think about it, more intuitively. And while researching this idea and looking at some modern ideas, a number of people I've seen on YouTube and other places have claimed that emotions are in fact hypnotic or trance states. This is an over-exaggeration. I mean, indeed, emotions can be blinding to the larger context. They can block out anything that isn't relevant to that emotion. And right, the process of the emotion itself is to instigate within the body the responses typical of the emotion. So when we're crying, we are sobbing, our breath is labored, our tears are streaming out of our face, and all of these physiological processes reverberate in the emotion, as well as the emotion opening us to all of the memories that are relevant to it and that reverberate in it. And this kind of blocks out anything that isn't relevant to the intensification and prolongation of that emotion. Okay, so sure, that is true, but it is rare that we actually are so deep within an emotion in that sense. And oftentimes we have emotions that aren't this isolating, aren't this tunnel vision and blocking out anything other than this single emotion. Furthermore, an emotion isn't putting us in an immediately suggestible state. As soon as we have a new emotion, we are not in this hypnotic state, so it's ridiculous to equate an emotion with a hypnotic state, although we can see that there are common features to both that have to do with our filtering of what we are aware of and the intensifying of certain psychical elements through, the technical term is centration, concentrating on certain physiological and memory content of our perception, feeling, and awareness. And in both the work of Bergson and Pierre Genet, we find really helpful distinctions made between hypnotized states, the flow state, as well as passion and related phenomena like charm, and as we're going to see in a minute, music, which is for Bergson a hypnotized state. Passion is a kind of emotional state, we might say, but it is one of devotion and of devoted attention, such that one is not distracted from their devotion to this. If you have a passion for playing music, or you have a passion for doing philosophy, or for writing a book, or whatever it is, you're fixed on this and you are not distracted by anything. You're kind of, it's kind of like a fugue state, right? Everything else goes out the window and there's only one motivation and goal. And in fact, passion is the engine of skill and motivation and innovation. And while passion is a kind of self-induced hypnotized state, we could say that charm is a relationally induced hypnotized state where we are drawn in, we are attracted, and our attention is narrowed, right? And this induces or incites or inspires passion. The charm of a work of art can inspire us in many ways. It can inspire us as an artist, or it can inspire us in our life, and it can inspire us morally. And the clearest example of this for Bergson is music. And in listening to music, the key is that we actually imitate the sounds to some degree. In order to hear clearly, whether it's the voice or whether it's a melody, we actually sort of speak to ourselves with an inner voice, imitating the person. When you follow what someone is saying and you read their lips, it is not uncommon for people to actually mouth what they're hearing the other person say. And when you're very closely listening and kind of forget yourself and fall into a sort of hypnotized state, you might actually be mimicking the speech of the other person. Well, this is what's going on in music. When we hear the sounds, when we follow a melody, we are actually articulating those sounds within ourselves. We are set in motion, both in our body and our mind, by these sounds, and we imitate them and participate in them. Here's what Bergson says in Time and Free Will. He wants to look at the creation and appreciation of beauty through a sort of conscious effort. He says, placing ourselves at this point of view, we shall perceive that the object of art is to put to sleep the active, or rather, resistant power of our personality, and thus to bring us into a state of perfect responsiveness, in which we realize the idea that is suggested to us and sympathize with the feeling that it is expressed. In the processes of art, we shall find, in a weakened form, a refined and in some measure spiritualized version of the process commonly used to induce the state of hypnosis. Thus, in music, the rhythm and measure suspend the normal flow of our sensations and ideas by causing our attention to swing to and fro between fixed points, and they take hold of us with such force that even the faintest imitation of a groan will suffice to fill us with the utmost sadness. If musical sounds affect us more powerfully than the sounds of nature, the reason is that nature confines itself to expressing feelings, whereas music suggests them to us. Whence indeed comes the charm of poetry. The poet is he whom feeling develops into images, and the images themselves into words which translate them while obeying the laws of rhythm. In seeing these images pass before our eyes, we, in our turn, experience the feeling which was, so to speak, their emotional equivalent. But we should never realize these images so strongly without the regular movements of the rhythm by which our soul is lulled into self-forgetfulness and, as in a dream, thinks and sees with the poet. And further on, he says that nature, like art, proceeds by suggestion, but does not command the resources of rhythm. It supplies the deficiency by the long comradeship based on influences received in common by nature and by ourselves, of which the effect is that the slightest indication by nature of a feeling arouses sympathy in our minds, just as a mere gesture on the part of the hypnotist is enough to force the intended suggestion upon a subject accustomed to his control. And this sympathy is shown in particular when nature displays to us beings of normal proportions, so that our attention is distributed equally over all of the parts, the figure without being fixed on any one of them. Our perceptive faculty then finds itself lulled and soothed by this harmony, and nothing hinders any longer the free play of sympathy, which is ever ready to come forward as soon as the obstacle in its path is removed. These reflections are actually incredibly profound insights into the nature of musical experience and the role of teleology and purpose within music. We enter an open state of suggestion where we give up on our own personal goals and our attention to life, our need to control and respond to the world, and we, push to the side all of the worries which we have for the world, and we enter a kind of hypnotic and trance-like state, which is restful and which is not moving in any direction, right? And this is typical of what we might call ambient music or spectral music, where we are frozen in the state of mindfulness rather than moving along with the melody and being lulled into the rhythm, but also being excited by it and being inspired to dance, or in the other examples of intense emotional music, we are brought to tears. So in many forms of music, the trance-like state is used transitively as a liminal space which draws us towards certain worlds, certain experiences, certain states of consciousness, certain attitudes, while ambient and spectral music instead freezes us in that state and keeps us in the liminal space of inaction and inattention. Spectral music does this in a particular way. It uses the timbre and the sound quality to force our attention into the sonic, sensible world as such, but without needing to follow a certain movement through that space, but rather to take it in atmospherically as a kind of whole, a totality. And this composing style of spectral composing is based in the harmonic series and an understanding of the overtonal space as related directly to timbre. So the timbre and the space are intertwining and sort of reflecting each other in spectral music, and that prevents us from drifting in our conceptual thinking and our ways of following a certain emotion, and instead to be in a kind of open, meditative state of mindfulness, imbued as a totality with the quality of the sonic plenum. So there's this kind of spectrum here within different musical forms between the suggestion and the hypnotic effect of the music. Suggestion in music is what directs us. It's what redirects our teleology. It's what gives us a new directive, you could say. We adopt the idea and the intention and the feeling and the attitude of the music, and we ignore our world and our past, and we indulge in this world created by the musician in the same way that we do with a poet or an author or in the movie theater. And in spectral music, once again, we can preside in the world of the sound alone, forming no figure which emerges from a background. We are in this very hypnotic-like state where everything is in the background. The hypnotic state, in a way, is kind of like the mind wiper device for Men in Black. As if that device worked for a few minutes, that would be very similar. You know, all of a sudden, we sweep away all of the priming content of our memories, emotions, and everything that was directing us to have a selective perceptual monitoring of our situation. We clean the slate temporarily. We open ourselves to all of these elements coming back gradually and gradually regaining our attention to life. But this can happen part by part, you could say. These hypnotized states are not paralyzing forever. We wake up from them, even if the hypnotist never gives the command. And nevertheless, this command, the end the trance command that they snap their fingers and you wake up, is a very peculiar as well aspect of hypnosis. The control over another person's agency that doesn't seem to be there in music. When the song ends, we regain our attention to life, and because we were voluntarily engaging in it, it doesn't feel as if someone was commanding us, but perhaps this same underlying thing is at play in both cases. And no doubt something like a hypnotized state can come about in our everyday consciousness without anyone inducing it. Sometimes when I'm very tired watching TV, I have this slight shift in perception, like a change in perspective, or like moving from a wide-angle lens to a telephoto lens, so that the TV feels somehow both very close, but also at the same time very far away, and it's huge, like a movie theater or something. It's this paradoxical sensation. It feels as if I can't move, or the idea of moving is completely outside of my field of experience. It's a quasi-sleep paralysis, but one in which I am extremely comfortable and I feel as safe as can be. It feels also, though, a bit impersonal. I'm not worried about my safety or even have a sense of personal existence. It's kind of pre-personal experience. At the same time, it also feels somewhat solitary, but a strange solitary that doesn't feel detached or separated. It just feels like this fundamental feature of reality, this being there in the void, present, but not caring at all, just being there. It's a kind of dissociated, hypnotized state. Okay, so what can we learn from these things? How can we connect these to the mind-body relation and our understanding of consciousness and life and things like that? Well, the hypnotized state is rather strange. It's one in which we are connecting in our psychical life the body and the mind in a strange, unordinary way, which is no longer mediated by our consciousness, our active attention, holding our sensory motor world in a certain way and allowing certain memories to come into our conscious experience in order for us to get around in the world and talk to other people and have a coherent sense of life. In these cases, our mind and our body are working in tandem with our consciousness. But in the hypnotized state, our consciousness, our attentiveness, is in a way disabled. It is this stillness and tranquility of the mind, a mind without motive, a sort of deactivated or inattentive mind. But this state, as we see, allows for an increase in memory and imagination. It's a quasi-dreamlike state, but one in which everything is in the background, and when things emerge into the foreground, we are not in a certain line of relevance and meaning such that all of the images have to connect to each other and that we direct them in any attentive and practical sense. That is what is deactivated, right? The need to put everything together for a certain goal in view. Now, the body, on the other hand, is in a heightened state of perception, and it has an extremely excited sensitivity, but without all of that passing over into consciousness. And this is clear in Bergson's experiment. The patient doesn't realize that they are actually reading the letters in the cornea of the hypnotist. They believe that they are actually reading the hypnotist's mind. Now, it turns out that they are, in fact, capable of reading these very small images on the cornea, and the attentiveness of this quasi-consciousness that is still there in the attempt to fulfill the suggestion given by the hypnotist. They use any means necessary, Bergson says, and they figure out how to answer the question in a satisfactory way, but they don't actually know that they're doing it. They don't know that they're merely reading the image off the eye. They actually believe they are divining it through telepathy. So there is this disconnect in the hypnotized state between the body and our awareness registering what's going on and synthesizing it in memory and experience. It's not a complete dissociation from our sensory experience or from our memories, but it's being there with them without identifying with them, without feeling they are our own. Again, it's a kind of telephoto lens, zoomed in but also spaced out, closed off, kind of aimless. It's also described sometimes as like feeling slow motion. There's in this space, in this slow motion, zoomed in experience, there is a coming in of images that appears to be unconscious, right? We don't feel that we are the author of these images. They are arising, and we don't necessarily even identify with them. We don't give them our attention. We don't follow every single one of them. It feels as if both our memory and our body are other than us. They are doing what they do on their own, and we are not guiding them. One reason maybe so many philosophers have struggled with the relation between the mind and the body is not simply that they have artificially severed these, but because the lived body is no simple matter. It's not a clear and well-known idea or sensation. It is an extremely complex and singular, unique interweaving into an organism of the whole universe. It is the source and reason for all of our ideas and emotions, but it is one which acts on its own, which informs us from time to time of its needs. There is this kind of separation between its needs and our intentions and our wants. And there is also a kind of community and intersubjectivity, a relationality between our mind, our spiritual memory, and our body in its quasi-independence. And while these things are inseparable, the mind and the body are inseparable, they are clearly distinguishable, and this is drawn out in the hypnotic experience in particular clarity. And for Bergson, it also highlights the fact that mental life, our psychical life, is all about increases and decreases in the intensity of lived energy. And in this inactive state of our consciousness, when we are not directed towards practical life, when the attention to life has been temporarily disengaged, we find that this activity of consciousness, where the narrowing of our consciousness concentrates our mind's energy, is not necessarily the highest intensity of our consciousness. When we are fixed in our consciousness, there's something about that fixity which involves a lower degree of intensity for Bergson. But it's also not all about intensity in the sense of activated living energy. For Bergson, virtuality is much more important in some sense. It's by concentrating this virtual energy, we might say, that consciousness increases its tension and becomes creative and spontaneous and free. When we narrowly focus our attention, on the other hand, consciousness actually tends to decrease. We tend to become habituated. We enter a sort of flow-like state where we are not actively thinking about everything that we're doing. We off all of those things and we go with the flow and we act seamlessly with the moment. And this is the paradoxical idea of this tension here, because on the one hand, there's a certain ease, right? There's a certain loosening of consciousness that at the same time involves a much broader, wider, and in fact more creative and inventive and gathering together a much vaster set of details within our consciousness, a wider psychological state. And some people have tried to suggest that hypnosis, this hypnotic state, is actually something like a return to a more ancient form of consciousness. You will hear people say this kind of stuff today too, that the hypnotized state reduces us to the reptile brain, for example. And I think there might be some truth to this, but this is mostly incorrect. The reptile brain is supposed to be this embodied know-how that doesn't arise higher than the level of instinct, but is also in the hypnotic state supposed to be without the attention to life. So how would that be the reptile brain? The reptile brain is constantly worried about avoiding that. So that's one small problem with that. But no, there's a further problem, because the hypnotized state is in fact a state of intellectual and memory awareness, but one in which we have reduced and disconnected consciousness in a way. So consciousness has become dysfunctional, or a quasi-consciousness, where the psychical state still involves a coexistence of the body organism in its lived activity, as well as our memory and thought. But they are disconnected, and that disconnection is a removal of action. But there's still a kind of play going on between memory and sensation and imagination. They are not completely severed from one another or dissociated. The memory begins to appear automatic and as having its own agency. It feels that we are not supervising over the images that arise. We are not lording over them, creating them, following them, and synthesizing them. We are, again, kind of hung in the void, and hung in this void adjacent to these two beings that act independently of one another, but are also in harmony with each other, and which have some depth, some transcendence, some otherness to our personal consciousness. No doubt when we leave this state, we will always identify both of these processes with ourself. The personal consciousness typically identifies with both our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, right? Normal psychology says, these are my feelings, these are my thoughts, these are my sensations. Although we, in this state, find that the sensations, the feelings, and the thoughts are not all sourced from the same center. In these rare dissociative states, where the attention to life is suppressed, the multiplicity of the self is visible. It is possible, I would say, that our ancient ancestors used hypnotic states periodically to better coordinate their activity, such as hunting or any other complex tasks. They would achieve this complex, organized action, concerted action, by entering into a sort of hypnotic state. Perhaps a ritual prayer brought their minds and their bodies in tune, and also this state would have allowed a commander's voice to act as a sort of central authority, and one would instantly execute the act on hearing it, and without thinking about it or interpreting it or anything. And such a state is not brainwashing, but is instead a sort of psychological intensification of this attuned, shared intention, shared attitudes, postures. Even everyone is sort of imitating each other, moving as one, and responding and flexing with the movements of the group as a whole. Again, the body is in this heightened state of its senses and movement, and the stilling of the mind gives this extreme focus on the task at hand, a kind of flow state that opens to a greater intersubjective sympathetic resonance. This is, again, something that we see in music among musicians, and music among the ancients must have built and reinforced all of these psychosomatic bonds that allow people to work in synergy together. There are no doubt hypnotic effects of music that must be at work in non-musical settings, such as anything involving social synergy, right? This is also called entrainment. We move in mass, and if we see a crowd funneling out of a theater and we only see their bodies, we would think, oh, what a thoughtless herd all moving together. But we also know that each person is having a conversation or thinking their own thoughts and has different feelings. And as we see, there is a variety of degrees of entrainment, and it can happen on the level of the mind, it can happen on the level of the body, it can happen on the level of both mind and body together in concert, right? This sort of shutting off of personal consciousness, shutting off of moving against the crowd, but also of being open suggestively. There's a kind of social fluidity, right? When we all sit down and eat together, this whole posture of our bodies, the way that we all sit there somewhat quietly, and not that we don't also have a conversation, but we are imitating each other's body language and staying within a sort of norm of behavior. And we enact a kind of prototypical behavior. And this is, in some sense, a condition for our gathering together, our being safe and sharing spaces together as humans. And we see it with many types of social animals. So this investigation of hypnosis really shows a lot of essential features of our consciousness, of its permeability through social relationality, the intersubjective side of our consciousness. Now I just want to end by thinking a little bit about modern hypnotherapy. The big idea in all hypnotherapy is that the hypnotic state helps block out the noise, and that this allows for the other techniques of psychotherapy to be done in a kind of controlled environment. It temporarily puts us in a state in which we can dive deeper into our memories and feelings. But as much advantage is gained here, I think just as much vulnerability is opened. The traditional methods of psychotherapy are probing, right? And these probing moves, pushing a patient to think about certain traumas and things like that, there are certain typical traumas, and the therapist in their probing can actually guide suggestively in unintended ways, and can create memories and can actually make things worse in certain situations. The whole idea behind hypnotherapy also pivots on a question of belief. The reason we are able to be suggested in the hypnotic state is that we believe the hypnotist or the doctor or whatever it is has some ability, and it is this conviction that we readily accept in the hypnotized state that creates a dedication of our mind to something. It fixes our mind on a certain idea. But it's crucial that we understand what a belief is and how beliefs function differently within the hypnotized suggestion and everyday life. And I don't think that they can be equated. There is a different sort of belief which arises through the hypnosis. What I mean is, I don't think it's right to say that a certain passion arises from a belief alone, right? If you have a vocation, a calling as an artist or a philosopher, a musician or teacher or something like that, you don't simply believe that this is something you should put your time on. You have something like an intuition of your ability and the value of what you're doing, and those implicitly guide you, right? They're kind of unconscious motivation in your action. You have in your memory and in your desire and in your anticipation for the future all of this weight pushing you in this direction, and this isn't simply a belief. So I think the modern explanations of hypnosis, which try to reduce the phenomena to belief, really miss the richness of this phenomena and its similarity and difference to other phenomena, and we cannot simply explain it through one other phenomena, but it is its own, that must be understood on its own right and as a combination and disabling of other parts of our normal psychic life.